In Westminster Halls, a Pride and Prejudice variation written by Don Jacobson, performed by Benjamin Fife. Book 1. The Stench of the Trade. Ane licet invitos in servitutem dare. Is it lawful to make slaves of others against their will? Cambridge Latin Essay Topic, 1785. Prologue. As it is usual to read these essays publicly in the Senate House soon after the prize is adjudged, I was called to Cambridge for this purpose. On returning, however, to London, the subject of it almost wholly engrossed my thoughts. I became at times very seriously affected while upon the road. I stopped my horse occasionally and dismounted and walked. I frequently tried to persuade myself in these intervals that the contents of my essay could not be true. The more, however, I reflected upon them, the more I gave them credit. Coming in sight of Wade's Mill in Hertfordshire, I sat down disconsolate on the turf by the roadside, and held my horse. Here a thought came into my mind, that if the contents of the essay were true, it was time some person should see these calamities to their end. This was the summer of 1785. Thomas Clarkson. The road to London, near Wade's Mill, Hertfordshire. Tom Bennet removed his hat and turned his face to the sky. The summer sun warmed him and silenced the small voices that had beset him since yesterday in Cambridge. Bennet rode toward Meryton this morning after spending a sennight at his alma mater. The call of the great university's towers rang loud in the years after his time reading the classics. Longbourn held little attraction for Bennet, although, as his father's heir, he understood the need to be an attentive understudy. Yet his heart always leaned toward the bookshelves lining the study. Father and son had agreed that the racks were Tom's province, while Sam Bennet managed the estate's affairs from the oak work table in front of the window overlooking the grey and white, river-pebbled front drive. A burgundy leather chair and low footstool by the hearth allowed the son to disappear into Plutarch or Seneca, while being near at hand in case the father had a question about a tenant or an expense. A few days short of a fortnight had elapsed since his ancient's master had written Tom about the upcoming reading of the year's winning essays, a new tradition now set at the end of Easter term. He had urged Bennet's attendance with an unusual appeal. "I have written young Bertram, but I doubt he will attend his old tutor. He may not be in the country if his father has sent him off to the family plantations in the Carib. The loathsome practice that fills the Bertram coffers, and not distance, may be why he would avoid the symposium. I may underestimate your friend by tarring him with this same brush as his father, but I may not. That is why I take up my sword and beseech you to return to the crèche from which you sprang with such promise. I regret I could not reveal Aristophanes' allure more convincingly, and entice you to abandon your familial responsibilities. That is an old story, and I cannot belabor you with my disappointment. Of such many a life is made. You, my pupil, are not built for regrets. Other riches may entice you to abandon grain husbandry and root vegetables briefly. Our former master at Magdalene, Reverend Packard, who is, as it turns out, a hide-bound radical, was floated to the heavens last year as the university's vice-chancellor. Safe in the sinecure, the old Oxonian abandoned his conformist stance and rattled our masters with the Latin essay competition based on the abolishment question, ane licet invitos in servitutem dare. Whilst matriculating, you may have encountered Thomas Clarkson, the son of a Cambridgeshire cleric. He was a year behind you, and admittedly not of our august Magdalene community. If you attend for no other reason, although I would be flattered that you would bless me with the opportunity to share a bowl of tobacco and a dram of Juarez, you must for his lecture. With all the students having fled to England's four corners, your old rooms await." And so Bennet begged his father for a fortnight's freedom. That worthy smiled in recollection of the busyness owned by a man with but 25 summers. There would be time enough to narrow his son's horizons from the greater world to a small market town, limiting, although only 24 miles from the centre of the world. Now, questions that elbowed their way into Tom Bennet's ken, whether he wished it or not, paved the road to Hertfordshire. Longbourn's acres had remained unchanged for the past century, since the India House trader Christopher Bennet had brought it under his control. Tradition dictated much of what the Bennets and their tenants undertook on the land nestled in the bend of the Mimram. The world rarely imposed upon Meryton. Tom was pleased that colonial slavery had never taken root on the old island. Influenced by Edmund Burke, like his father, young Bennet fully embraced country Whiggish tendencies to despise those who made their bread from the broken backs of slave labour, or through commerce in weeping souls. Aristocrats who tried to keep their hands clean by dealing through men of business, while adding thousands from the sugar trade into their accounts, likewise earned his scorn. His contempt for those so evil as to suggest the Bible sanctioned their acts made Bennet particularly receptive to the singular essay he had heard scarcely 2 days ago. Clarkson, a St. John's graduate, Bennet did not eschew the other colleges, offered a thesis setting on its head every pro-slavery argument. Clarkson tore off the fig leaf and rent the veils to render impotent every claim made to give cover to any owner, procurer, or trader seeking to distance themselves from the pernicious vileness. Clarkson's case resonated so profoundly that Bennet barely recalled leaving Cambridge in the dawn's morning pink. He hardly noticed the road home to Longbourn. What he had heard set loose the dogs of doubt, mainly what he could accomplish as a gentleman of a modest estate. Over the miles his study had become darker and more unsettling. The world about him faded the deeper his contemplations. His inattention had let Cato's pace slow to a bare walk. Bennet rode alongside the Mimram below Ware. The sound of Wade's Mill's great wheel was the back-tone surrounding him. As he turned his face to the road ahead, a surprising tableau appeared. Another man, a traveller Bennet supposed, sat on the verge, head supported by both hands. A hat obscured his face, but his clothing was gentle, if not first circle quality. His horse cropped the tufty grass a few feet away. The subject of Bennet's attention never moved, even when Cato approached and halted nearby in response to Bennet's gentle tug. However, as he dismounted, the vagabond let loose a gust of a sigh, giving evidence of life. The man lifted his head, surprising Bennet to the extent that he would never forget their first encounter. The man who had left him so troubled sat on the ground before him, Thomas Clarkson. "Ah, friend," Clarkson began, "are you an angel or a demon? Although I own you look like neither. However, I will be optimistic and pray that one of Gabriel's minions has come to me as he did Moses in the desert. I fear I am in no state to wrestle. I have been doing more than enough of that as I try to return to town. The weight of my thoughts has become so great that I worry my poor bay cannot carry me further." Bennet's laugh at Clarkson's dark humour shivered the afternoon air. "I must agree that you are the thinker of deep thoughts, but you cannot regret those ideas. You, sir, for I heard your talk, are on the edge of a great leap that will define our generation and those yet unborn. Would that I knew where you would lead, for I would account myself to be a follower." "Then you would be my first," Clarkson ruefully said. "But maybe that is to both our fortunes. I may lead you to spend your life in a mad pursuit of the unattainable. One person, you, I could quickly turn away from my path. It will be exceedingly more difficult to dissuade a multitude. Perhaps I should seek my folly, as that is how our betters see it, in solitude. You see, sir, while I wrote the words, it was not until I read them aloud to men like you that they impressed upon me their integrity, and thus their import. Now, when I close my eyes, I see the outlines of a great cause." Bennet stepped in. "A great cause. That has been roiling my spirit for a dozen miles. Ending the Egyptian exile of millions and saving our collective souls seems a task that even Heracles would find beyond his demigod powers. What can I, the eldest son of country gentry, do? We have little reason to traffic with those who would hold others in bondage." Clarkson struck like an adder. "Do you put sugar in your tea?" Bennet looked at his feet, ashamed. A gentle hand on his arm caused him to look up into a pair of warm brown eyes. "Do not be chagrined, dear sir. I was unkind to abuse one espousing my crusade. I, too, have a sweet tooth, much to my mother's cook's delight. My weakness is her lemon bars. I regret that I will have to forego that treat, until no man must brave the lash to sweeten my afternoon." He stuck out his hand. "Allow me to introduce myself to a fellow Cambridge man, Clarkson, Thomas Clarkson of Cambridgeshire, London, and, I imagine, anywhere that will have me." Bennet's chuckle rumbled deep in his chest. "Bennet, Thomas Bennet, of Longbourn, near Meryton, but a few miles ahead down the river road leading to Hertford. You must call me Bennet, and if you allow me the familiarity, I will call you Clarkson. You just said anywhere that will have me. I can promise that such a harbour rests below a knob atop which ancient fortifications brood. We call it a mount, but it is just an orphaned shoulder of the Chiltern uplift, split from the main ridge by this stream, the Mimram, digging its way to the lee. Longbourn is but 10 miles away. You, Clarkson, will find a berth there today, and whenever you wish. I will not be gainsaid. Let us remount, for I cannot allow you to lay by the roadside when my parents' parlour awaits. Oh, and my father's port. Can we agree that while the Portuguese have a checkered record in Brazil, Douro's grapes are grown by free labour? That will be my father's position, and I doubt if our youthful ardour will shift his taste to gin." Clarkson tipped his head back in hearty laughter. "Bennet, I swear I will allow the elder Bennet his fortified wine, if he takes his tea with good, free English honey." They mounted and rode on, little thinking that from such serendipitous encounters are lifelong friendships made. Chapter 1. Longbourn, December 5th, 1806. Black-edged packets were exceedingly inconvenient, especially for a man like Thomas Bennet. Their tiresomeness was multiplied by forcing Bennet to choose between rereading Marcus Aurelius's commentaries and considering the Message's news. By their very nature, mourning-shrouded letters insisted on immediate opening, contrary to Bennet's normal inclination to avoid intelligence requiring him to abandon his library. He racked his brain as he flipped the missive in his hand. There was something familiar about the stationery. Its thickness told of wealth and power. He looked up at Hill. "An express rider delivered this?" "Indeed, sir." "Is the messenger still here?" "He is." "Please bring him here." The man's well-tailored livery, gently dusted by miles in the saddle, told Bennet that any hopes he had to reply with a courteous letter of condolence had died like the letter's subject. Bennet addressed the rider. "If I am not mistaken, you are of Lord Grenville's household?" What does the Prime Minister want with a lowly Hertfordshire gentleman?" "Oh, that I canna say," the courier said, "but perhaps Mr. Clarkson's will have more for you." He reached into his tail pocket and extended another message, its edges pristine. Accepting the second, Bennet laid the two side by side on the desktop, much as he wished to allow his friend to prepare the ground for what was sure to be uncomfortable. Grenville's letter, unfiltered by Clarkson's explanations, would set the stage. Cracking the seals embossed with Ricardian lions, Bennet spread the large post-sheet flat, gently smoothing the creases to read astonishing news. By the direction of the Prime Minister, to Mr. Thomas Bennet, Longbourn Estate, Meryton. Sir, my Lord Grenville commands me to inform you that your member, Mr. Lyman Long, has died. Mr. Long was the victim of a calamity arising from the Lord Mayor's Guildhall dinner preparatory to convening the new session. According to many distinguished men, tainted seafood was the culprit. Over half the assembly was sickened, although the parliamentary delegation, of which Mr. Long was but one, suffered the most. At last count, 11 members had perished. The Prime Minister has received royal assent for immediate by-elections to fill the vacancies. Longbourn, Meryton Village, is a borough with 24, now 23, electors, of which you are the most senior. It is, therefore, incumbent upon you to assemble your fellows within 3 days of receipt of this letter, to ensure a speedy return of a new member who will be in attendance when the Speaker calls to order the House of Commons on 13 December 1806. Lord Grenville asks a personal favour of you, because of his knowledge of the crucial matters to be called before the Commons this session. You, Mr. Bennet, must stand for the Longbourn Meryton village seat. Mr. Clarkson has assured the Prime Minister that you are of a like mind concerning the great issue. The rider will carry your reply to the Prime Minister's office in Westminster. I am most sincerely yours, Thomas Annesley, M.A., Secretary to the Prime Minister. A postscript put paid to any effort at demurral on Bennet's part. I do not doubt you would take comfort in our Lord's plea to let this cup pass from me. However, Clarkson assures me that you have been of a kindred spirit for 20 years. We need your vote, if not your voice. If, after we prevail, you desire to return to friendlier climes than those at Westminster Palace, you will leave with my heartfelt thanks. Grenville. Pulling a face at the Premier's adroit manipulation, Bennet was under no illusion that he had to go to town, if only to ensure that the dream he had held since '85 was not stillborn. His mouth still tasted ash at the memory of '93's great hope. Now, 13 years later, slavery's forces had retreated and could not appeal to the fear of Jacquerie, brought on by tampering with the status quo. That old saw, if not toothless, was dulled to uselessness, although, as Bennet knew, a blunted tool was more dangerous than a sharp one. Tory and Whig alike knew Bonaparte was no revolutionary. However, even after Trafalgar, the Emperor remained an existential threat. Standing on the side of the angels by ending the trade could only honey bitter future tax levies needed for the war. Brighter, although more cynical political minds grasped the virtue of rejecting the venal trade in favour of wrapping Albion in virtue's banner. Clarkson reminded Longbourn's master of his commitment. Bennet, I am not dunning you for your delayed subscription. Your annual contribution, when no others would reply to my letters, kept our campaigns alive over the years. I sometimes wonder if you sacrifice your lady's security to keep the glimmer of our hope alight. I cannot begrudge you anything. I understand that in your world, weather can spell the difference between surplus and retrenchment. No, old friend, it is not money we need, but rather you. I turned to Grenville to make my appeal. He is not asking you to join government, but rather to sit on the back benches and occasionally utter, 'Hear him.' Come to us. We need you to push past the line. After 11 years, we now have a chance. October's election brought in new men of the abolitionist stripe. I need your steadying hand to help these new men keep their resolve in the face of the forces arrayed against us. See." Bennet despised finding himself in a position where he had no choice but to act. A request from the Prime Minister was one step removed from a royal command. Even if he could ignore that imperative, the knowledge that his friend had spent political capital to move Britain's leader engaged every shred of Bennet's honour. He was bound for London. However, a congenial amanuensis at his side would ease Bennet's time in Gracechurch Street and Westminster. Pemberley, December 7th, 1806. Darcy stared grimly at Grenville's summons. Being the owner of the rotten borough of Kympton Abbey, now nothing but a dozen moss-covered stones, was proving inconvenient. However, as much as he would wish to remain closeted in Derbyshire, nursing his private pain over Georgiana's summer-time fiasco in Ramsgate, he could not argue with the great man. Darcy's civic responsibility called him to town. He could rest comfortably knowing that his sister was already at Selkirk Castle to celebrate the holidays, and hopefully regain some of her spirit, with their aunt and uncle. Darcy would enjoy seeing his family after burying himself in post-harvest work. Together they would travel back to town after Twelfth Night. Belay that. Wilberforce's note froze his last thought with a complete picture of the altered terrain. Unfortunately, we cannot wait for a fresh election to replace your member. As the Prime Minister explained, he expects you to come to Westminster immediately, while your father always instructed the member for Kympton Abbey to vote with the government. He allowed for a modicum of liberty regarding matters of conscience. However, in the case of the great cause, Mr. Twillings agreed with your revered father. We must immediately advance the bill on abolishing the trade while the election's enthusiasm remains undimmed. Otherwise, the demands of the war will overshadow all else, subordinating, perhaps for another decade, idealism for patriotism, whether genuine or cynical. I have not been in your company since you were a lad up from Eton. I cannot pretend to know the contours of your sentiments. I pray that you will take up your father's mantle. W. He leaned back in his chair and sipped from the crystal tumbler. A grimace curled his lips in metaphorical distaste. Darcy could not fault Wilberforce's concerns about his position on the institution. Throughout his years at Eton and Cambridge, slavery's debate had swirled about Darcy. Some, like sugar scion Tom Bertram, defended the need for compulsory free labour and unfettered trade along the Middle Passage to replenish ranks depleted by disease and weariness. Others were agnostic on the subject, although finding little wrong in a practice that added carriages and candlesticks to their fathers' estates and townhouses. They avoided speaking about it for fear of alienating those higher in society's pecking order. Only a few emulated earlier Cambridge men, and staunchly decried enslaving any of God's children. Although Darcy knew his mind, he revealed nothing to the rest of the world. His mask was impenetrable. Those who encountered Darcy could be excused for assuming he was no different than other rich men's sons. Pemberley's wealth stemmed from Derbyshire's fertile flanks. Fitzwilliam often wondered why George Darcy had looked away from monumental Barbadian sugar profits. But as a practical matter, the son knew ample money flowed from Pemberley's fountain. Let others live their lives as they wished, feathering their nests without any judgment by him. To Fitzwilliam Darcy, managing Pemberley without worrying about the morality of what was legal in modern England was enough. Now Wilberforce had sounded a clarion call, implicitly demanding he carry on his father's legacy. For his part, occupied with maintaining the estate, Darcy had given the question little thought. Little else would pave the road to London. Chapter 2. Gracechurch Street, London, January 12th, 1807. Elizabeth collected a footman, James, one of Longbourn's stalwarts, and a maid, another Meryton familiar, Sarah, to accompany her the 6 doors to Mrs. Walter's house. While an impoverished gentlewoman would have accompanied many women of Elizabeth's age and class, she was original enough to move about, propriety secured only by servants. The sun soaked into her as she walked away from the warehouses and past the fronts of homes that became increasingly more fashionable. "Aunt and uncle's home is pleasant and well appointed, in a most modern manner. Mr. Nash's touch is so apparent. Gardiner House exudes prosperity without shouting about the size of my uncle's bank accounts. There is a solidity about it that tells a stranger that the occupants are refined and genteel beyond the Ton's misguided expectations. The further we move from rushing clerks and street vendors, even 200 feet, gives owners the happy license to pretend they front on Grosvenor Square. I can see new money's influence here. How sad that these homes' mistresses see the facade of apparent status. So many bear themselves like a woman clad in yards of orange velvet beneath turbaned ostrich feathers. Brass's shine can never replace old gold's burnished glow." Her ruminations about architecture's social implications ended as she arrived at the townhouse at the corner of Leadenhall Street. Here, finance's quiet current dominated rather than the bustle of trade. Walter's house, better termed a mansion, presented 2 understated and elegant windowed walls, each opening taxed, to the world as appropriate a dwelling at the intersection of great streets. The source of the family fortune, India House, dominated the skyline to her left with corniced shoulders. Uncle Gardiner had explained that Mr. Walters, long an Honourable East India Company director, refused to lord his incredible wealth over other less connected merchants, while he, like Rothschild, faced the disdain of the landed aristocracy. His ability to fulfill Mr. Pitt's requirements for electoral fertilizer kept him in good odour in Whitehall, and led to invitations to many of the less visible gatherings of the great and the good. Rumours of an impending barony swirled around the man, although his contributions to the government and loans to the regent were worthy of a viscountcy. Regrettably, Mr. Walters, India House governor and remarkably wealthy, was still sneered at as a tradesman, while he could slip into White's alongside Earl St. Vincent to discuss naval estimates with blue bloods. Multiple black balls would drop if the Admiral dared put him up for membership. Instead, while careful about who they admitted into their home, he and his wife kept the company of town's smaller fry, whether in the trading or manufacturing class. Mrs. Walters's salons were community legends. A steady flow of ladies from Mayfair parlours and Gracechurch Street's Quaker meeting-house crossed her threshold. The black-garbed latter were more likely to be addressing the assembly rather than sipping tea and rubbing against silk-draped legs on the richly upholstered divans and side chairs. Over the past month, since she arrived in London, Elizabeth had become her father's eyes and ears outside of the palace of Westminster. There, Mr. Bennet, now invested as member for Meryton village, spent about half his time either in session or, the bane of his existence, the forced idleness of committee meetings where tools of great men bloviated. More ad hoc gatherings in St. James Street's walnut-panelled rooms kept him away from Gracechurch Street. When freed from his labours in Westminster, Thomas Bennet burrowed into his trunk of books. He left the reading of government papers and memorials from groups seeking his vote, many with the promise of or actual inducements to help him support their petitions, and the creation of synopses, to his secretary, an 18-year-old woman. Rather than fleeing from bureaucraties' dense type marching across cream-coloured battlefields, Elizabeth found the mounds of government documents curiously involving. They put her, a young miss from Hertfordshire, in the middle of the pivotal issues of the day. By comparison, her usual fare, agricultural tracts, novels and poetry, and the occasional accounting ledger, faded into obscurity. Elizabeth had sought to see the world from her father's library. However great Mr. Milton's prose was, the dry, almost desert-like quality of parliamentary daily orders and transcripts of member speeches forced her mind to build the world in which they existed. Her escape was still the bard's work of every stripe, from sonnets to tragedies. These Elizabeth found to be entertaining and provoking, but also often trenchant on the nature of people, society, and politics, even from a 2 centuries-old perspective. However, her work at her father's elbow soon grew. Unable to shed his hermit-like inclinations, Thomas Bennet sent a scout into the wilds. Elizabeth's remit was broad. Keep him from looking the fool by touring the town in her guise as a curious but rustic young lady. Whatever she learned would form his behaviour and help Grenville, Wilberforce, and Clarkson shape British policy. Like Joshua's spies in Jericho, I move through the city unnoticed and unremarked upon. None of these self-important men, let alone their hostesses, are conscious enough to wonder at a new piece of decorative art crossing their threshold. Who would suspect a bit of countrified muslin to be any different from hundreds of fluff-brained, lace-crazed daughters of the ton flocking around the edges of the cause, either pro or con? Elizabeth's treks into the swarm gathered about slavery's treasure chest confirmed her disgust and the truth behind her camouflage. There are few women of intellectual substance in a slave trader's drawing-room. They could not be countenanced by those who live to dominate their surroundings. Women serve only 2 purposes for men like these: decoration or... Men feel free to unburden themselves to wide-eyed pretty ones who gasp at their victories on the mercantile battlefield. Seeming dazzled is not so difficult once you master the vacant gape that converts to a pretty pout. Then, by making my eyes even more vacant and my comments even more innocuous, I can slip into the opposition's pack to hear their hatred of men like Papa, and their self-righteous moralizations about the correctness of breeding their chattel like cattle. Those who think in pounds and pennies, and not human suffering, find it easy to puff out their chests and unburden themselves, often speaking the truths they usually keep hidden. Her intriguing beauty was a facade she could hide behind and observe the slave-traders' party. However, playing the spy was not the only way Elizabeth helped her father. Aunt Gardner was invaluable in securing invitations to ladies' get-togethers, where tea found its sweetness from English honey and not Jamaican sugar. The difference between the two groups was night and day. While the slavers were all men, with women present only to provide plumage, to confirm male power, the ladies drove the anti-trade salons. For some, this was a trendy affectation, a flickering desire to stand on the side of angels, and to be seen doing so. They appropriately tut-tutted as speakers decried the evils of the institution. Then, heads held high in righteous fervour, they returned to their fathers' or husbands' houses to drape jewels about their perfectly shaped necks, gems paid for by the bodies served up as shark food along the middle passage. Since slave trading is easy to hate and difficult to defend, it becomes attractive to those wanting to demonstrate some degree of engagement beyond deciding which ice to order at Gunter's. Most are there to seek the approbation of one of the patronesses, well known for their distaste for trade of any sort, slave or otherwise. The hangers-on will never become true believers, no matter how many teas they sit through, or how many viscountesses they befriend. They will limit their involvement to having their companions slip a few guineas into the subscription basket. Others, though, had braved the label of blue-stocking to read Mr. Equiano's autobiography, depicting the harrowing and shameful tale of his capture, sale, and transportation across the Atlantic. An intimate of Longbourn's library, Elizabeth also had worked through her father's collection of abolishment pamphlets. Intellectually armed and shielded, she could hold her own in conversation with the speakers and other like-minded ladies. Although men refuse us the vote, our voices will be loud in drawing, dining, and, yes, bedchambers. Chapter 3. Walter's Townhouse. The festive season was past, but the days remained short and, except for an inveterate walker like Lizzie Bennet, dreary to the extent that indoor diversions remained preferable. January's chill held the damp promise of an early spring in this southern clime. Handing off her heavy cloak, Elizabeth turned toward the buzz of conversation drifting from the parlour. She expected to encounter the usual blend, a few countesses of middle age, several young tradesmen's wives, sprinkled with maidens old enough to be out while accompanied by their companions. Visits to Mrs. Walters's salons and others, sponsored by the Tons doyens, allowed her to brief her father about middle and upper-class feelings on pro-abolition arguments. The women had their views, of course, and were not bashful about sharing those of their husbands, even those that smacked of sympathy with the trade. In those instances, narrowed eyes foretold a problematic future for a spouse seeking to swim against the household's current. Men were in attendance, but they tended toward wild-haired idealists with shiny cuffs above ink-stained hands. There were exceptions. Papa's friend Mr. Clarkson, despite his passion for the cause, understood that for a person to be heard, he must also be seen without leaving cod-liver oil's taste. A well-tailored suit of clothes was as much a weapon as words, smoothing the way for the message by not offending the audience's sensibilities. Less John the Baptist and more Joseph of Arimathea. Accepting a cup of tea, Elizabeth cast her eyes about the room, hoping the savant would be there. That was not to be, but she did see a face she observed recently from across the room at a reception for Isaac Gascoigne, one of Liverpool's members and an ardent supporter of the slave trade. Although not introduced to her, Elizabeth had heard a name bruited about Charles Brooke's parlour, Darcy. Perhaps he was that man her father had mentioned as having considerable influence due to his Matlock connections. However, today she saw not the peacock strutting before fat-fingered men with waistcoat buttons straining to contain slavery's prosperity. Instead, the gentleman showed favourably in a nicely cut topcoat of black superfine over fawn-coloured pantaloons. Corinthian, not rattle. His chestnut-brown hair curled across a clear brow, framing pale blue eyes that flicked about the room, cataloguing personal encounters, greetings, and new connections. He riveted her attention. She unconsciously drifted through the crowd. A curious enchantment pulled her toward the room's perimeter, where the object of her fascination stood. Elizabeth had learned that, in gatherings mimicking the atmosphere of Madame de Staël's great Parisian salons, propriety's rules were relaxed to lubricate stimulating conversation. Thus, formal introductions were optional. She slipped into a gap at his elbow. "You seem uncomfortable to be here in this all-female world. When I saw you last week surrounded by Gascoigne's toadies, you were equally stone-faced, although none noticed. So interested were they in patrolling the corners of their sty." He started at her barnyard analogy, but regulated his expression of surprise. "You do not spare your disdain for the men who control much of England, madam." Elizabeth arched an eyebrow and hissed, "Are you defending those creatures? Are your views more in harmony with theirs than your presence here would suggest? Why were you there if 'twere otherwise? Why are you dressed so differently here than there?" His hardened visage swung towards her. "I will never countenance the sale of humans into foulest bondage. If we could muster the votes in Parliament, we should see the day when only free men live beneath the British flag. However, as a realist, I know that is a difficult hope. A half measure is better than none. As for my clothing, I array myself as is appropriate for where I am and the expectations of those about me. The conspicuous display of fortune is disgusting, not serving honest merchants struggling to improve their social standing. My motive at Brooks House was to blend in, to show I was sympathetic. Ought I have dressed like one of the gentlemen from the meeting-house, and hectored them for their wickedness? As for your overarching inquiry, allow me to respond in kind. Where might I learn the most about the opposition? At Mr. Wilberforce's home, or General Gascoigne's? Besides, I was tracking a fellow I have known from childhood, a fellow Derbyshireman. I wanted to see with whom he consorted, and overhear what others said of him. And since you, madame, were at Mr. Brooks' house, are you not vulnerable to the same accusations you just levelled?" No naïve, Elizabeth's own experience had taught her the value of scouting the opposition. She ignored his challenge and changed her tack. "I realize that it is not de rigueur to introduce ourselves to one another. Collecting her speakers occupies our hostess, so she cannot perform the office. However, I would know you, sir. I am Miss Elizabeth Bennet. I accompanied my father to town as his secretary when Lord Grenville insisted he take up the parliamentary yoke and serve as member for Meryton, after the incumbent succumbed to a batch of bad oysters. I heard a name at Mr. Brooks, and I think you might be Mr. Darcy from Derbyshire, also here in town because of the Lord Mayor's unfortunate choice of seafood. Nobody introduced the gentleman, but my father suggested the member for Kimpton Abbey was in the anti-trade camp, making his attendance unusual to say the least." Arching an eyebrow, Elizabeth continued, "You were playing the spy, travelling under a false flag, as naval officers would say, to deceive the pro-trade crowd. Only an ardent advocate for the cause would risk his reputation to associate with those people to hasten the end of their business. Thus I surmise that you could be Mr. Darcy." He shook his head, a slight smile adding to his attractive features. "No, Miss Bennet. I fear your sketch fails because you never saw the man. Darcy would not have dressed as I did that afternoon, even if he wanted to play up to that crowd. He would never compromise his appearance of morality for anyone or anything. What I wear today is closer to his usual attire. He is sombre, and congratulates himself for being seen as the epitome of an English gentleman. I have known him for years. I grew up on his father's estate in Derbyshire. My father was Pemberley's steward, but old Mr. Darcy saw that I received a gentleman's education. Despite that condescension and my refinement, Miss Bennet, I remain on the wrong side of the social gulf as far as Darcy is concerned. Darcy would never sully his reputation by associating with someone as humble as me. He has cut me since we were at Eton. He is so jealous of his image that he refuses to associate with anyone remotely connected with trade, except in a transactional manner, dealing with solicitors, purchasing books, or meeting with bankers. Those not meeting his social standards can never earn his good opinion, even if they behave like an archbishop. I have been his victim for years. His father, my godfather, had planned to install me in a valuable family living, Kimpton. But even when the spot fell vacant after Mr. Darcy's death, his son refused to honour his wishes. I remember the elder Mr. Darcy with great fondness. I could never say anything about him that would bring his memory into disrepute. He saw me as a young man of promise. However, his son, much of his animosity rises from jealousy of his father's affection for me, has done nothing but try to hinder my success. Elizabeth's voice shook in outrage. This Mr. Darcy sounds insufferable. How could he ignore his father's final wishes? You say he prides himself on being a gentleman. Why would he do that over a pulpit? The usual reason. Money. Do not let appearances deceive you, Miss Bennet. They are all gentlemen until you come between them and their money. The Kimpton living turns a tidy sum every year. I imagine Darcy had one of his lackeys lined up for the spot. Someone willing to pay for the privilege of raking in the tithe. Well versed in the world's cynicism, Elizabeth tried to understand. Could you not take legal action to gain what ought to be yours? Was not Mr. Darcy's last testament explicit in your favour? Oh, no, Miss Bennet. The bequest was peculiar, and not a written instruction, but rather the aspiration of a father believing his son would follow the fourth commandment. Old Mr. Darcy wished me to have the living if I took orders. Once his son told me in no uncertain terms that he would rather rot than see me get the preferment. I had to make my own way in the world. As you can see, I have been rather successful. He paused as if deciding to share his next revelation. He lowered his voice. Darcy was the man I was following. You did not see him because he already was closeted with his patrons, men who profit from the trade but never sully their hands with manacles and chains. They sought to reassure themselves of his vote in opposition to the bill. That, of course, was secured in the traditional way. Traditional way? In reply, he extended one hand palm up and rubbed his other hand across it in the universal gesture. For someone as wealthy as he, Fitzwilliam Darcy still looks for more, and he doesn't care how he gets it, as long as it clinks pleasantly in his already deep pockets. How reprehensible! The baseness of deceiving those who trusted him as their voice. Well, if you are not Mr. Darcy, who are you? George Wickham. Chapter 4. En route to the Royal Opera House, January 12th, 1806. Mr. Wickham's disclosures about one of her father's colleagues were deeply troubling. Elizabeth resolved to address them as soon as was practical. However, Mr. Bennet was taking her to the opera for a performance of Herr Mozart's Die Zauberflöte. A great sacrifice. Elizabeth knew how her father despised the pretensions of box subscribers. She smiled as she recollected Papa's discomfiture as he revealed he had secured 2 seats for them in Lord Grenville's stall. However, it is Papa's way of saying thank you for my efforts since we arrived. He affects an air of indolence leavened by persecution, if not by the 6 women in his life, then by the Tories and Whigs with whom he rubs elbows daily. Yet Mr. Bennet is like a Dutch chocolate, dark, even tangy on the outside, soft and gooey on the inside. Practicality vanished in the face of Aunt Gardiner's insistence that Elizabeth prepare herself for the opera, as was befitting the daughter of one of the 658, a far more exclusive number than the 10,000. Each member, irrespective of the number of voters in his constituency, served by virtue of being elected rather than finding themselves one of the tons elect because of birth. An azure silk gown had been pulled from Madeline Gardiner's wardrobe to be nipped and tucked to fit Elizabeth's maidenly frame. Yesterday, one of Gardiner's express riders rushed to Longbourn, to return with Grandmother Bennet's Indian sapphire set, deep blue to near navy. The hours after Elizabeth's return from Walter's house vanished, as Sarah took Jane's place to dress Miss Elizabeth Bennet's hair and array her in her evening finery. The finishing touch was Aunt Gardiner's midnight velvet cloak lined with crimson silk. With pattens strapped to her slippers, Elizabeth took her father's arm, balanced herself, and carefully walked to the carriage. Elizabeth dismissed any thought of discussing Wickham's assertions as the Gardiner equipage rattled from Gracechurch Street to Covent Garden. She knew anything of that nature would fracture her father's fragile composure. For more than 20 years he had lived to end the slave trade. His focus was not as singular as Uncle Clarkson's. The man had always been part of her life, and had become as much an uncle as Papa's brothers Phillips and Gardiner. But he would keenly feel any defection. Her stomach roiled each time she considered the rank betrayal of the cause. Elizabeth had no desire to spoil whatever enjoyment her father would take from the evening. She turned her face to watch the buildings slide by. En route to the Royal Opera House. A damp wash-rag had more spine than Darcy. 3 weeks into his recovery, he still felt like a bundle of spinach tossed in hot oil, limp and wilted. Grenville and Wilberforce have been remarkably tolerant of my absence from the house. Bingley and Bennet have done journeyman's work, keeping me up to date. Bennet's papers have been remarkable for their organization and trenchant observations. Mrs. Reynolds was rightly concerned when I had Hastings pack a valise and strap it behind Prater's saddle. Then I spent 3 days riding south and enjoying indifferent weather that varied over 200-odd miles, only in the intensity of the sleet blowing in from the North Sea and Channel. I rode like the Furies were nipping at Prater's heels, or if George's schoolmistress had written of a cold that had swept through the girls and laid my sister low. Any other man would have stayed on the Great Northern Road toward town, except that it would have added a day or more to my journey. Committed to the coast road, I should have taken the ferry at Hull and gone to ground at Barton-on-Humber. No, Darcy the dependable was sensible, and took the long way around the estuary, adding 30 miles of misery. More fool me. My inclination to be useful led to my downfall. I managed to attend the opening of the session, and then fell into a racking cough, pounding head, and a fever that refused to break. Wilson summoned Mr. Campbell, who ordered me to bed and told the staff that if I set foot out of my four-poster, he would have me restrained. He would have needed an axe to chop through his peaty brogue. "Pneumonia kills the old folks too often, but is lessen a threat to the young. But young Darcy, sir, ye could be doing me wrong by making a liar o' me." So I stayed put and drove Mrs. Wilson to distraction by playing the world's worst patient. If I never sip another cup of willow bark tea. Now that Campbell has granted me the freedom of the city, I had to escape Darcy House, lest the four walls begin to close in on me. Fortunately, I can leave the opera whenever I wish without inspiring much comment. I made it clear to Bingley that I did not include his sisters in tonight's invitation. He may be willing to countenance Miss Bingley's antics. I have almost no reserves to maintain my self-control. If she steps from his carriage, I will return to mine and leave it to Bingley to explain the unpleasant facts to his sister. His evening planned, Darcy now Socratically essayed his foul mood, since Mr. Wilson had brought the late post, a note from a friend. How is it that blackmailers always amicably referred to themselves as friends? Reminded him of the perilous nature of his sister's reputation after her Ramsgate summer sojourn. He recognized the hand and wondered how much he would have to pay to keep the cur from bruiting George's disgrace about town. His musings were interrupted as his carriage rocked to a halt in front of the theatre. Stepping out, Darcy took a moment to adjust his clothes and survey the crowd before the main entrance. Even at night, with the west wind freshening the air, the fog of open sewers and horses by their hundreds of thousands was oppressive. His grimace drew a flower girl who won a penny for a nosegay. Gentlemen, if they were able, footmen, if the escorts were not, flooded the walkway to assist ladies tottering across the slimy stones leading toward the runner, rolled down the marble steps. Feathered turbans added to the impression of instability, although the platforms favoured by the women did not help. Darcy could not help but remember Master Pepys's diary and a passage he had uncovered as a Magdalene College student. The Royal Navy's first secretary offered a man's opinion of a woman's footwear, something unchanged in the 140-odd years since the great chronicler had put pen to paper. Called on my wife and took her to Mrs. Pierce's, she in the way being exceedingly troubled with a pair of new patterns, and I vexed to go so slow. Looking toward Covent Garden's portico, Darcy caught sight of Thomas Bennet helping a young woman from a carriage, two in front of the Darcy coach. A frown began to cloud his forehead. Although he had met Bennet only once, on the back benches behind Lord Grenville's cabinet, his brief encounter left him with the impression that Meryton's member was a family man who eschewed the ton's unrestrained behaviour. Darcy was surprised to see a man his father's age squire a colourfully dressed young woman. Then again was he astonished that a country gentleman endowed with position and turned loose in town would offer carte blanche to one of Westminster's bits of tattered muslin. Men follow their instincts, which foremost rest behind their drop fronts. Those of a particular age are especially susceptible to a pretty pout, widened eyes, and lean-in listening. I imagine she plays the courtesan's part to perfection. Even from 50 feet away, the woman was particularly engaging. Her hood had fallen back, and her chocolate locks glistened in the torchlight. Jewelled pins held tresses in an entrancing coiffure. In profile, her slightly upturned nose distinguished her from the crowd of aquiline-beaked daughters of the Tom. A robust native intelligence animated her face. She paused on the lowered step to be eye to eye with Bennet. Reacting to something he said, her bow-shaped lips parted in laughter that struck Darcy as genuine and unstudied. Holding Bennet's hand, she stepped onto the roadway. Darcy staggered under the impact of her loveliness. Not for a moment, though, did he imagine she was anything but what he had been used to seeing grasping town gentlemen's arms. Never wives, but rather an evening's kept entertainment. Her cloak obscured a figure that did not offer any appearance of stockiness, always a problem for petite women. A shapely leg broke through the cape's slit, framing it in crimson. Her innate sensuality was effortlessly presented in Eve's pose, knee bent slightly, tightening her rich blue gown across a thigh to promise delights hidden beneath. Bennet's companion unleashed the hounds of imagination, settling curdled in his belly. The woman's profession disqualified her from consideration as Mrs. Darcy, but compared to the Tom's candidates paraded before him, she hewed closely to his ideal. He saw himself seated across from her in Pemberley's library as they read to one another of an evening. She would tuck her bare feet, dainty toes curled to display flower-petal nails, underneath her legs. The hearth would embrace them in an orange circle. Darcy would send them to the Lake District with Mr. Wordsworth, while she would counter with Shakespeare's sonnet that spoke to her eternal love for him. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Darcy shook himself to eradicate the image of tousled tresses spread across his bare chest. While he had the needs of a healthy man, he had rarely availed himself of the pleasures discreetly hidden behind doors adjacent to the better districts. He was no Galahad the Pure, but he found it easier to repress longing than seek satisfaction in the arms of someone paid to tell her customers that each encounter was her life's best. This capture of his heart was not to be borne. Every fibre fought the firm hand clamped atop disloyal emotions. These uncomfortable feelings draped over fields blackened by the threat to the family name. Wresting control, Fitzwilliam Darcy buried everything but heightened disdain deep beneath layers of practised hauteur. Like a bull-mastiff catching sight of a stag-hound infringing on his bailiwick, Darcy walked stiffly toward the opera's shelter, closing on Bennet and the woman. Her mincing steps angered him. Then she stumbled, only to be rescued by Bennet's arms. Leaning away from his chest, she threw a thankful smile. Bennet genially set her back on her feet and absently patted her arm. How brazen these town women are, using their arts and allurements to turn heads of men old enough to be their fathers. Why he did not veer away to avoid an inevitable meeting, he could not answer. Later, and throughout several nights' reflection, Darcy understood. He concluded that he needed to confront them. Only then could he issue the angry slight that would injure her for choosing the paramour's path and denying herself the trail to honourable matrimony. His fury became incandescent, yet the flames were dark and froze rather than burned. As he approached, the sound of his boots on the sanded stones drew Bennet's attention. "Ah, my friend, how well you look after 3 se'nights fighting whatever grip was throttling your spirit. Aesculapius has indeed smiled at you. May I introduce my—" Darcy arrogantly cut him off. "I have no interest in tolerating any woman who finds her daily bread anywhere further above stairs than the dining parlour. We may have to engage with one another, sir, in the ordinary course of business before the house. However, that does not require me to give consequence to any of your acquaintances engaged in the world's oldest profession. Your private preferences are your affair, sir. I need not know the name of your paramour to know what she is. Although your reply is unimportant, I am curious about the going rate for a woman of such obvious talents." He looked sideways to see how hard his bolt had struck. His target did not disappoint, except that her reaction was not to descend into hysterics, and depend on her protector to answer for her. The young woman's eyes first showed shock, and then narrowed in anger. Carmine patches, making her even more beautiful in Darcy's estimation, stained her cheeks gone pale. Setting her jaw, she made to advance on Darcy, but Bennet restrained her. Having made his point, Darcy looked directly into her rich brown, near chocolate eyes before allowing his grey-blue orbs to drift away to the procession moving up the carpet. His cut could not be more obvious. Darcy observed the elder man's jaw clenching as he prepared to answer Darcy's litany. However, that reply would probably be a challenge, something Darcy would never countenance. He was, after all, Fitzwilliam Darcy, the Earl of Matlock's nephew. Pemberley's master would no more meet someone of modest estate on the field of honour than he would bow to Caroline Bingley's attempts at compromise. Both were beneath him. Rank's distinction must be maintained. A challenge from Bennet would be akin to Darcy demanding satisfaction from the Duke of Westminster, ludicrous on the face of it. Better for all if the man swallowed his words. Forestalling Bennet's rejoinder, Darcy spun on his heel, returned to his carriage, jumped in, and slammed his walking-stick on the ceiling to signal the driver to pull out of line. Chapter 5. Throughout Darcy's assault, Bennet's heart pounded, his face growing progressively hotter. With one arm he moved Elizabeth behind him to shield her from the knife-edged words. His eyes flicked about the walkway, checking to see if Darcy's assault was drawing attention. However, none seemed aware of the tableau. Darcy's withdrawal was equally unremarked upon. The multitude had their eyes focused on the river of quality streaming into the building. His departure left them speechless, until Bennet gently guided Elizabeth back to their carriage. She was the first to catch her breath. "Papa, who was that man? And why did he presume you had a former familiarity? How could he have called me what he did?" Bennet's chin dug deeply into his cravat, his eyes hooded in shadow. "I am sad to learn you are worldly enough to know what he meant. Your mother would rain a peal down on me for allowing you the liberty of my books. We know each other, but I thought I knew him better. I think I may have lost his good opinion, although I cannot understand why. As for his words, his slice at me was a scratch, but he tried to gut you, my sweet child. He thought you were one of those soiled doves who live on the edges of polite society, fluttering about old men's purses, and assuaging tattered egos with flattery. As the carriage rocked back toward Gracechurch Street, Bennet dropped into an uncomfortable silence without satisfying his daughter's curiosity. Yet, even as he mulled, he noticed the stillness shrouding the forward-facing bench. He knew Elizabeth's ways. Unlike his wife, his daughter never thought aloud, preferring to be well organized before she gave voice to anything. The longer she was quiet, the more stubborn she would be. Bennet did not have to wait long. Her huff carried no small amount of ire. "That man is a fool if he believes you would dishonour my mother to squire a fancy woman about Covent Garden. A place full of gimlet eyes and wagging chins, just 24 miles from home. Right now this misunderstanding is a private affair. From what I could tell, nobody was close enough to hear what he said. That does not mean we can ignore it. I cannot unhear his insults, nor, I imagine, can you. What we do next, I am unsure, although I would dearly love 5 minutes when I could tell him what I think and pin his ears back. I thank you, Papa, for your self-control. I have read enough novels to know that he offended us, mainly me, with mortal slurs that you could avenge only if you threw down the gauntlet and invited him for a meeting to eat grass for breakfast. A challenge was suitable, except he has 20 years on you, and is equally adept with pistol or sabre. You would have condemned Mamma to live her worst nightmare. You must tell me the man's name if I am to punish him." The carriage rocked its way onward for several moments, before Bennet acidly said, "Darcy. His name is Fitzwilliam Darcy." Mr. Gardiner's study, Gracechurch Street. Bennet and Elizabeth swept through the front door, rousing Uncle Gardiner from his comfortable fireside chair. His inquisitive look earned him a "do not ask" from his brother, and an agitated look from his niece. Prevented from following them to his study, the master shook his head, and retreated to confer with his wife. While they waited for coffee and rolls, Elizabeth had told her father a long night may be ahead. Bennet poured a short sherry for her, and a long port for himself. A maid bustled in with the coal scuttle, chivied there by Gardiner's alert housekeeper, who knew something was amiss when the Bennets had returned scarcely 2 hours after leaving. 2 wing-back chairs faced the fireplace. Settling in one, Bennet kicked off his boots before extending his long legs and stockinged toes to warm his feet before the crackling fire. Another knock brought Sarah in from the family bedrooms upstairs to collect Elizabeth's jewels, gowns, and gloves. She had also brought 2 banyans, one of heavy knotted wool that Mr. Bennet jokingly referred to as his smoking jacket, the other silk. A back corner of the library became a dressing-room where Sarah helped Elizabeth with her gown and petticoat. Then, topcoat, dress, and boots in hand, the young woman left the father and daughter to their conference. Elizabeth had enjoyed a thimbleful of Iberian nuttiness in the past. However, at 18, her experience with adult beverages was limited, usually just a glass of wine with dinner, and certainly nothing stronger than ratafia at Aunt Phillips's house. Tonight's draught was more substantial and, she mused, more therapeutic. The warmth soothed Elizabeth's throat and relaxed her enough to settle deeply into the chair's Cordovan-dyed leather, rather than perching atop the cushion's front edge. Elizabeth fixed her father with a potent stare. "I cannot repress myself. I had planned to tell you something I had learned this afternoon at Mrs. Walter's levee, but not until tomorrow. However, tonight's unpleasantness demands that I inform you instantly." Bennet's eyes widened in wonderment at her adamant statement. Finishing his drink, he bent forward to pick up his coffee before signalling her to continue with a nod. "You told me that you had a friendly but professional acquaintance with Mr. Darcy, that the Prime Minister summoned him to the house for the same reason as you. Yes, and he has been ill for 3 se'nights. I sent several of your precis to inform him of the doings before the Commons. Our chance meeting at the opera was the first time I had seen him since the session opened." Elizabeth absorbed the indication that the relationship was more than a nodding one. "So Mr. Darcy is beholden to you for helping him stay apace of the issues?" Bennet scanned a thoughtful look. "Yes, and that makes his ungracious, belligerent behaviour doubly confusing. He acted like a bear with a sore tooth, and never allowed me to introduce you. I understand what he mistook you for, but he immediately jumped over every other possibility, as if that were the only reason you could have been on my arm. He acted as if your very presence offended him." Elizabeth could not claim any extensive knowledge of the male of the species. However, Master Shakespeare's tragedies proved instructive. "Once you hear what I relate about Mr. Darcy— no, Papa, this is no idle gossip, like Mamma and Lady Lucas favour— you will understand his deeper motivation. Like that doomed Scottish laird Macbeth, he reacted because of a sense of shame and guilt." Elizabeth then explained her conversation with Mr. Wickham, including that he had followed Darcy to Brooke's townhouse. Her earnest delivery insisted that Thomas take every word at face value. He had often stated that his Lizzie was an astute student of human behaviour, and if she sketched someone, it was one step away from Mr. Gainsborough. When she finished her story, Bennet's chin firmed. "I must let Clarkson know about this. The bill would be in trouble if we lost him. While the House seems to favour abolishing the trade, the slightest wobble by someone like Darcy could start a rush for the nay lobby. Darcy speaks for his uncle, the Earl of Matlock, and half of Derbyshire. While the back benches owe much to the ministry, the slavers have deep pockets too, which can be persuasive. Based upon what you learned from this Wickham fellow, and I would appreciate speaking with him, I can see that something dangerous is afoot. We have endured more than our share of plots since '93. If we take Wickham's story at face value, Darcy's behaviour is easily explained. I doubt he expected to see anyone tonight who might ardently support the cause. When he did, though, he came at us like an imperial column to feel better about his inconstancy." Bennet stood up, padded to the sideboard, and grabbed the brandy decanter. He tipped it toward Elizabeth, who shook her head, desiring to avoid the fumes distilled from cognac's best grapes. Her father shrugged and filled a fresh tumbler before turning back to Elizabeth. "Wickham's story rings true in nearly every detail. The desire for ready cash, the willingness to do anything, including being indebted to those in trade, and a conspicuous arrogance that countenances any action as right and moral if he does it. I would bet that every word Mr. Wickham spoke sounded as if it came down from the throne on high. That is why it is so convincing. On top of that, to an innocent like you, Mr. Wickham did not fit the image of a conniving man, but instead gave every appearance of goodness. Yet there is one inconvenient truth. I know, as you do now, that Darcy has been bedridden since December 14th. If so, how could Wickham follow him to the Gascoigne reception last week?" Elizabeth froze at her father's words. The bard was known to show his audiences who were either villains or heroes through physical devices. Mr. Wickham looked and sounded the latter's part. He did not own a hunchback, a hooked nose, or a propensity to sneak about furtively. Having been exposed to tonight's Mr. Darcy, I cannot doubt Mr. Wickham's account. Why would he lie to me when the member for Kimpton Abbey has every reason to deceive? She focused on where her father stood. "While I accept your question as posing a valid point, One need not be true for the other to be false. Whatever weaknesses in Mr. Wickham's story might confirm Mr. Darcy's behaviour when he came upon us at the opera. Given how Mr. Darcy acted tonight, I wonder if he was so bound to his bedchamber that he could not have escaped his warders to visit with his benefactors, if only for a brief period. He seemed healthy enough, able to don evening wear and immerse himself in the flood tide of the Ton. Mr. Wickham's account is too filled with fact to be a rank falsehood. Mr. Wickham did not say Darcy was dancing a country reel at Mr. Brooke's house. He told me Mr. Darcy met with his employers to receive his 30 pieces of silver and instructions. If the man is motivated by pounds and their comfort, he could find the strength to drag himself a few streets before spending another week recovering. No, Papa, until someone offers more evidence either exonerating Mr. Darcy or indicting Mr. Wickham, I will hold fast to my conclusion that what I told you is the unadulterated truth. The fire cast Bennet's careworn features into harsh relief, making his face a chiaroscuro map worthy of one of Signor Goya's portraits. He took a long pull on his brandy. You are an apt student of human nature, Elizabeth. However, I beg that you keep your judgment provisional until you can confront Mr. Darcy with his guilt. You sometimes hold fast to your initial impression, rather than assess their character's true nature. Your prejudice against him, although well-founded, may blind you to alternate explanations. Chapter 6. The Study, Darcy House. Richard Fitzwilliam sprawled in the armchair, his heavily muscled legs stretched out to the fire's warmth. The Colonel's knee-high Hessians were nowhere to be seen, having been spirited away by his batman. A decanter of Darcy's favourite brandy sat on the adjacent side table. Fitzwilliam wiggled his toes, enjoying the glow which drove away the chill. Those digits had been tender since he became lost overnight on a winter stag hunt at Matlock in '91. The tiny fire he built kept him alive, but he could not prevent frostbite. Besides his cousin's spirit collection, the Countess of Matlock's absence made Darcy House more appealing. Fitzwilliam's mother had launched another of her annual campaigns to marry off her second son. Invitations to musicales, teas, and intimate dinners en famille absorbed almost every waking moment. "Oh, but we need to invite Viscount Wardley, the Viscountess, and their daughters to balance the table, Richard. You will be astonished at how attractive Lady Matilda has become. Her complexion has cleared remarkably." He dearly loved his mother, but sometimes needed relief. Escaping to Darcy House's quiet comfort was a better alternative than returning to the guard barracks. While the officers' quarters were well made, January's frosty fingers found their way through every crack. A rich orange fire fueled by sea coals was the wisest tactic. He was deep into his second glass when the library's door flew open. Darcy did not look toward the hearth, but strode across the room, angrily yanking off his cravat and throwing it on his desk. Fitzwilliam could smell the metaphorical smoke wreathing Darcy's hair. "Cousin, I thought you were for the opera tonight. Was the tenor drunk again and butchered his first solo? I know you've been ill, but you could have survived to the intermission. Or maybe something else provoked you to abandon showing your face in society for the first time in nearly a month. Either way, come join me. The brandy is certainly French and decidedly delightful. Of course, my brandy always tastes better in your mouth," Darcy snapped. Richard watched Darcy struggle out of his topcoat, looser than usual on his 6-foot frame because of enforced idleness. No visits to Gentleman Jackson's or Angelo's salle d'armes to keep his form. Darcy's indifferent appetite over the past 3 weeks also contributed to wasting away. Cook's vaunted lemon treats had a way of snugging pantaloon waistbands, but they had not enticed Darcy. My, Maman would be sorely disappointed in how you act, Darcy. What has bunched your small clothes? Darcy paused in his disrobing, his waistcoat hanging unbuttoned. Just how is your mother, dear cousin? You usually are content to eat her food and drink your father's brandy rather than mine. Has my aunt decided her best chance to save the household budget is to leg-shackle you to a suitably dowered heiress? That is when you winkle your way past Wilson and into my study. Is aunt on another campaign to make an honest man of you? Richard grimaced. What if she is? I have successfully dodged every one of Cupid's arrows fired by the silly girls she turns up. But enough about me. I am bored sitting here alone. I need entertainment, and drawing you out will be just that. You have something in your craw. Allow me to ring Wilson to bring some fresh soldiers. This flask's waterline is dangerously low. Then the interrogation can begin. Darcy found his cousin's nature snide, sarcastic, off-putting, and diverting. Richard Fitzwilliam, his almost brother, was what he needed after the day and night he had experienced. He marched over to his desk and pressed a lever hidden in the filigreed edge to open a flat drawer. He removed a small, still-sealed letter and walked to where the colonel sat. He tossed it on the table and fell back into his chair. Richard's look belied his earlier experiences in India, where the army had helped John Company thwart French designs. He cautiously leaned forward with measured movements, as if seeking to avoid cobra fangs. Picking up the missive, he flipped it over a few times, his muttered musings loud enough for Darcy to hear over the hiss and spit of the fire. Cheap paper, penny sheet, penny seal, watered ink. Nothing you couldn't get at any tavern claiming to be an inn. His voice strengthened upon looking at the hand that scribed the direction. Our boy may be living on short commons, or wants to give the appearance that he is nearly pockets to let. You must admire him. He is nothing if not about theatre. He wants another taste of Pemberley's fortune. How much did you pay him after Uncle George's funeral? 4,000. Darcy tipped his glass and, thirst slaked, ground out. Indeed, Richard. Wickham burns through money like a sailor in Pompey, waiting to leave for the Indies on the next tide. The simile is appropriate because he, like the British tar, has 3 pleasures: food and drink, gambling, and doxies, and not necessarily in that order. Add to that his desire to look the part of a gentleman of means.